Good evening, everyone else that will join us. We have, I think, a fascinating class for tonight, B'ezrat Hashem, dedicated in the memory of Yitzchak Tzvi ben Yosef, his Hashem Hashem elevation. And tonight is the yahrzeit of the Holy Ari, and we will talk about it, and I will teach something from the Arizal tonight as well. Okay, you guys ready? Yes. So we'll start with a joke, right? Why not? We need a joke. Chaim. You're allowed to joke. A joke if the joke is for Torah, you're allowed to say a joke. So they say a joke, a story was going to be connected about a Frenchman, an Englishman, and a Russian that are all together in their museum, and they're looking at this beautiful piece of art describing Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. Right? Beautiful painting of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. So the Englishman takes a look at the painting and says, look at how calm and how poised they are. They must be Englishmen. They're sitting with such dignity and respect. They're for sure Englishmen. And the Frenchman says, no, what are you talking about? Look how beautiful they are. They're so beautiful. They must be French. And the Russian says, no way. Here's two people. They have no clothing, no food, no shelter. All they have is an apple to eat, and they think they're in paradise. They must be Russian. Okay. I share that joke because we're going to talk about someone who seemingly had an iron bed to sleep on, and yet the Torah uses the description of his bed to tell us a lot about him, and therefore also lessons for us. But we're going to get there all in due course. I want to start at the beginning. I'm going to go in order. So the beginning of the story is this week's parasha, this week's Torah reading. Moshe is about to pass away. And he tells the Jewish people his final will and testament, his final speech to the Jewish people that he's going to give before he passes. And the first 4 chapters of the speech is a review of the last 40 years. It's a rebuke, it's a review, and he reminds them about many different things that the Jewish people had done during the course of those 40 years. So Moshe is describing to the Jewish people how he conquered many lands for them. And I want you to read inside. We're going to share the screen, and we're going to read from this week's parasha. We're going to first read about the war that Moshe fought against the king of Heshbon. His name was Sichon. And we're reading this because I wanted to see the contrast to the next war that Moshe is going to remind us about, that he fought against Og. So let's pay attention. Here is text number 1, verse number 30 from chapter 2 of this week's Torah reading. The Torah describes, one second, good evening everyone watching, that Sichon, king of Heshbon, did not wish to let us pass by him. For the Lord your God caused his spirit to be hardened and his heart to be obstinate, in order that he would give him into your hand as this day. And the Lord said to me, behold, I have begun to deliver Sichon and his land before you. Begin to drive him out, that you may inherit his land. Then Sichon went forth towards us, he and all his people, to war at Yatzah. And verse 33 says, and the Lord our God delivered him to us, and we smote him and his sons, and all of his people. So what do we see over here? Moshe is telling the Jewish people, we were traveling. There were other nations that we were not allowed to fight wars against. Without getting into all the details, we came to the land of Sichon, and he also didn't want to let us pass. He came up to war against us. So God said, so God said, they're in your hands. We went to war, and we won the war. We conquered them. No big deal. What happens next? The very next verses continue. Now we're going to read chapter 3, the opening verses of the next chapter. And now we're going to learn about the next war that Moshe Rabbeinu fought. And this time it's not against a king called Sichon. It's against another king called Og. Okay? So you see text number 2? Then we turned up and went up the way of Bashan. And Og, the king of Bashan, came forth toward us, he and all his people, to war at Edrei. And the Lord said to me, Al tira oso, do not fear him, for I have given him all his people and his land into your hand, and you shall do to him as he did to Sichon, king of the Amorites, who dwelt in Heshbon. So the Lord our God delivered into our hands also Og, the king of Bashan, and all his people, and we smote him until no remnant remained of him. Do you see, my friend, the difference between the way God speaks to Moshe before the war with Og and before the war with Sichon? You see a difference in verse 31 and in verse number 2? You have the word in front of you. Look at the way God speaks to Moshe in verse 31. and the way that God speaks to Moshe in verse number 2. Two wars. One is a war against the king called Sichon, the king of the Amorim, and one is a war against Og, the king of Bashan. Moshe was scared. Very good. You see that? Here, verse number 2, the Lord said to Moshe, Al tira also, do not be afraid of him because I have given him into your hand. That's what the verse says. Now, I am going to make a statement now that I believe is correct, and I did a little bit of checking now before the class, that there is, I think, I may be wrong, but I don't think so, that there's no other time in the Torah that we find that explicitly that Moshe is afraid. If you look through the story of the burning bush, when God came to Moshe and he says, go speak to Pharaoh, the superpower of the entire universe at that time, and go demand that this nation of slaves, the Jewish people, should be allowed to go free. Moshe's not afraid of Pharaoh. He's worried the Jews won't listen to him. They ask him, what's your name? And I'm not a man who's a good speaker. I need a sign. What will I tell them? But I checked. I read through the narrative, the dialogue between God and Moshe at the burning bush. Nowhere does Moshe express fear. For sure not of Pharaoh. Later on, when the God tells Moshe, Bo al Paro, come to Paro, we're told in the commentaries Moshe was afraid. He was hesitant. But it's not explicit in the Torah. There's not one single time in all of Moshe's life that we see him being afraid. Moshe is fearless. Moshe is willing to stand up and even fight God. What kind of person can say to God, God, either you give in to my ultimatum and you forgive the Jewish people for the sin of the golden calf, and if not, too bad on you, erase me from the Torah, I don't care. You know what kind of chutzpah you need to have? You know what I'm saying? Moshe was not a pushover. Moshe is a tough guy. Moshe stands up against Pharaoh. And who was he at that time? He was a nobody. He wasn't afraid to go walk into Pharaoh's palace and say to Pharaoh, let my people go. He gets angry at God when Pharaoh doesn't listen, but he never gets afraid. He goes to Pharaoh when he's in his private Nile River, as we talked about in the earlier class. He stands up to other kings. He stands up to the Jews that rebel against him. He worried the Jews. But here we see the time that Moshe is about to go to war and he becomes afraid. So what is it about this particular king Og that makes Moshe so afraid that God has to come to him and say, Moshe, don't be afraid. Al tira osa. Don't be afraid because I've already given him into your hands and you will be successful and victorious in the war against the Jewish people. Okay? Now, I'm going to answer that question. But before we get into that question, let me first tell you the story. What happens in the war? You know, always like some juicy details, right? Then we're going to go look a little further how Torah describes Og, and then we'll get back to why Moshe was afraid. What happens? Now I'm going back like 3-4 weeks ago to the book of Amid, but what actually happened during the war? So Og was a giant. Og was a giant. We'll talk a giant. You know, a giant. He was a massive, massive guy. Maybe that's where the word ogre comes from Og. I don't know. I just made that up now. Perhaps. Og was an ogre of a man. He was a giant. He was so big that when he saw the Jewish people coming towards him, it says in the Medrash, he picked up a mountain. He picked up a mountain. And he lifted the mountain up over the camp of the Jewish people to drop the mountain on the camp where the Jewish people were coming. That's how strong he was. And God did a miracle, and a colony of ants came, and they ate away the entire inside of this mountain until the whole inside crumbled. And the mountain came collapsing down. The inside crumbled and came crashing down on his own head. And he lifted it up over his head to throw it on the Jewish camp. It fell on his own head. And then when he couldn't see because there was a mountain on top of his head, it says his face got stuck in it. He tried lifting it. It says his teeth grew very long. God did a miracle. His teeth became long like a walrus. That he couldn't lift the mountain off his head because his teeth were sticking out into the mountain. And then Moshe came. Now you know how tall Moshe was? We're told that Moshe was 10 amos high, which is about 15 to 17 feet tall. 15 feet tall. Yeah, it makes me look like a midget. I know. Yeah, they were big people back then. And Moshe, who was 15 feet tall, I'm going to get to yes, this is after the flood. Very good, Marsha. Hold that thought. And Moshe jumps 15 feet in the air, holding an axe that was 15 feet long. And with this axe that was 15 feet long, when he jumped 15 feet in the air, he cut off the ankle of Og. And when Og's ankle got off, he fell down. And that's how Moshe killed Og, who literally fell into the hands of Moshe. And then, of course, they were able to conquer their cities. And they conquered, as the Torah continues to describe in the next verses, they conquered all their lands and all their cities. The Torah describes in detail all the conquering that took place. So fascinating. First of all, it gives you a little bit of idea why Moshe was afraid. This guy's a giant. He could lift up a mountain. But God did a miracle that the whole mountain crumbled on his head. Say again? His ankle. Well, Moshe jumped 10 feet, 15 feet. Yeah. 15 feet is 45 feet. Gives you an idea of how tall Og must have been. Literally a giant. Literally a giant. What? Higher than Goliath? Yes. We'll talk. Okay. So, that's the story. That's the story. Fascinating story. How he fell into the hands of Moshe. Other commentators use the name of God to kill him. But either way, Moshe kills him. Yes.
Where is this story written down?
In 3 weeks ago, in the parsha of Chukas, at the end of the parsha of Chukas.
And he talks about all that in the
No, the details are not there in the actual text. That's what we have commentaries for. We have the Medrash.
I actually read that all holding up the mountain is in the Quran. So imagine if the other religions.
Okay, the Quran has it too in Baruch Hashem.
I mean, it just points to there's something to it.
Correct. Okay, so now comes the interesting part. Now comes the really interesting part. I'm going to continue reading the text of how God describes in the Torah who is Og. Okay, so let's continue reading. We're going to just go to text number 3. It's the same chapter, just now verse 11. So verses 4, 5, 6 describe how after he killed Og, he conquered all the cities, and they divided all the lands of Sichon. They divided all the lands of Og. And then the Torah says as follows. Listen to the following verse and tell me how we should understand this verse. Verse 11. For only Og, the king of Bashan, was left from the remnant of the Rephaim. I'll tell you who the Rephaim are in a minute. His bedstead was a bedstead of iron. Is it not in the Rabbah of the children of Ammon? 9 cubits was its length, and 4 cubits its breadth, according to the cubit of a man. So this verse, let me just explain to you how to understand in English the verse, and we'll talk about the message of the verse, is describing how great was Og. So the Torah wanted to know, you want to know who Og was? He was, first of all, the last remnant of the Rephaim. That's clue number 1 why Moshe is afraid of him. I'll tell you in a second who Rephaim are. But his bedstead, says the Torah, he had a bed. You want to know how big his bed was? Well, I'll tell you. His bed was conquered by the Ammonites. When the Ammonites fought a war against against Og, they conquered the bed of Og and they put it in a museum. You have like a military museum to show things you conquered. His bed was in the museum in a place called Rabbah. How big was the bed? It was 9 cubits. That means about 16 cubits, feet long, by 4 cubits wide, made out of steel, made out of iron. Because a wooden bed couldn't handle the weight of Og. Og was so big that a wooden bed couldn't handle his size. And therefore, he had an iron bedstead. That's how big his bed was. Now, some say it was even longer than 9. The cubits here says the amma of an ish, of a man. Why does it say the amma of a man? Every amma. The word amma means the length of your arm, right? The size of your arm. But here, if you remember, I already told you that his ankle was 45 feet up in the air. So it means 9 arms of his arm. The amas ish means of a man of his arm. So it's not a 15-foot long bed, which would be the simple reading of the verse. It could be 100 feet long by who knows how many feet wide, but of steel. Now, I ask you a question. Do you know anywhere else in the Torah where the Torah describes the bed of somebody? The Torah, I've just read you the verse. The Torah wants you to understand who is Og. Og is the man whose bed, he was such a big guy, he was so heavy, so tough, that his bed was made out of steel, out of iron, out of barzel, and it was so big they put it in the museum. In the place of Rabbah, there's a museum, and all the museums like a little plaque. Here is the bed of the king of Bashan, the Og's bed, made out of solid steel, so he could sleep with it without sagging and having a bad back in the morning. You know what I'm saying? I don't know how they moved it. They had a lot of slaves carry it. I don't know.
He had a lot of friends.
They carried it. But this is the most fascinating verse. The Torah feels the need to describe the bed of Og. That's a good question. I mean, it's not me telling you, it's the Torah telling you. I'm just reading the Torah. So obviously the Torah is telling us about the bed of Og. There must be a lesson for us from the bed of Og. Correct? Well, before I talk about the bed of Og, let's talk about his history. Let's talk about his family. It's always good to talk about someone's family, right? Always some juicy stuff. So let's talk about the family of Og. What did we just read in the verse? Where does he come from? The Rephaim. The Rephaim. Who are the Rephaim? Who are the Rephaim? Okay. So we're going to go back now in history. All the way to the times of Avraham Avinu. I'm going to start by reading to you Rashi. The Rashi we're going to read, if you turn over the page, and you see in the gray box, that's the Rashi, when God says to Moshe, Al Tira also, don't be afraid of Og. So Rashi says, why would you think that he would be afraid? In the case of Sichon, however, it was not necessary to state, do not fear him. But in the case of Og, Moses feared lest the merit that he, Og, had rendered service to Avram might stand by him. As it says, and the fugitive came, and this was Og. So Rashi is telling us that the reason why Moshe is afraid of Og is because once upon a time, many, many years ago, Og did a big favor to Avram Avinu. What was the favor? So let's keep on reading text number 4. Genesis, now we're going all the way back to Genesis. So we're in Genesis chapter number 4. We're in Genesis chapter number 4. And in the 14th, remember the story of the 4 kings that were fighting against the 5 kings? Who remembers that story? Before we read it inside. Let's stop showing for a second. Remember the story? I'll tell you also in a second. Avram and Lot separate. Remember, Avram shepherds and Lot shepherds were fighting with each other and they couldn't get along. So Avram says to his nephew Lot, you choose where you want to go. If you want to go to the right, I'll go to the left. If you want to go to the left, I'll go to the right. Let's part ways. So Lot chooses to move to Sidon. Why Sidon? He saw the beautiful land. He saw the pleasures that were there. And Lot makes the decision to move to Sidon. We had a class on Lot, so we're not going to review it right now. He moves to Sidon. What happens? There was a war going on between the 5 kings that were in that region, including the king of Sodom, who was one of those 5 kings, against another conglomerate of 4 more powerful kings. For 12 years, they were paying taxes and they were subordinate to these other kings. Then they rebelled against them for 13 years. And finally, after the 13 years of a rebellion, of not paying their taxes to this conglomerate of 4 kings, the 4 kings come and make war against these 5 kings, and they win the war. They take many captives and plunder and loot, including who was captured? Lot, the nephew of Avraham Avinu. And then the Torah tells us, I'll tell you the story, and we'll see it in the text after. Then the Torah says that one of the refugees came and tells Avraham Avinu, Abraham, he comes to him, it was Pesach night. He says, your nephew was kidnapped and captured by these 4 kings. He's being taken as a slave. And Avram takes his faithful servant Eliezer. He takes another 318 men, according to the simple reading of the Torah, and they chase after these 4 kings. And Avram goes to war against these kings, ready to save his nephew. He takes dust, he throws it, miracles happen, it turns to arrows. And basically, in short, Avram miraculously wins the war against these 4 kings. He redeems all the captives, all the plunder. And then the king comes to him and says, thank you so much. Let me give me the people and you get the wealth. He says, I don't want it. He saves his nephew. Remember that story? Sounds familiar, right? Now let's read it inside. And you'll see I highlighted a word. And you're going to start to get some pictures now of the family history in context, in historical context of who is Og. Okay? So I'm going to share my screen for those that are watching us on Facebook. Thank you, those who are there. 1 second. I close this. I have to open it again. Okay, so here we go. We're reading now from the book of Genesis, chapter 14. And in the 14th year, Kedar Omer came, and the kings who were with him, and they smote the Rephaim. Remember that, right? In who's Rephaim? The family of Og. Yeah. They smote the Rephaim in Ashtaros Karnaim, and the Zuzim in Cham, and the Abim in Shava Kiryasayim. Don't worry about all the other names. So here we see that the family of Og, or Og himself, we're going to see Og, is from those who were kidnapped and destroyed by these kings led by Kedar Omer, who were destroyed, who were smitten. Then the Torah says, by Yovei Hapolit, one single refugee escaped. a fugitive came. Who's a fugitive? We can see it's a second. It's Og. He told Avram the Hebrew as he was living in the plain of Mamre, the Amorite, the brother of Eshcol, the brother of Aner, who were Avram's confederates. So basically, Avram is living in this place, and comes a refugee, an escapee. He says to Avram, your nephew Lot has been kidnapped. Who is this refugee, this escapee, this fugitive? Says Rashi to us, according to his simple meaning, this was Og, who escaped from battle. And this is what is referred to in Deuteronomy chapter 3, verse 11, that we just read a few minutes ago. Only Og survived from the rest of the Rephaim. And that is the meaning of survived, that Amraphel and his allies did not kill him when they smote the Rephaim in Ashtaroth Karnaim. Got it? So here we see the clear correlation in the verses. The Torah in verse 11 of chapter 3 of Deuteronomy is telling us, who is Og? Oh, he's from the Rephaim. He's the person that came, let me stop sharing for a second. He's the person that came to tell Avraham about his nephew Lot that had been kidnapped. He did a favor to the family of Avram, to the family of the Jews. That's why in chapter 3 of our Torah reading, we discover that Moshe is afraid of Og. Why is he afraid? Because he did a favor to Avraham. And Moshe says, all the other people I spoke up against, they were evil people. What spiritual merit did Paro have? None. He was an egotistical, narcissistic demigod who thought he owned the world. What spiritual merit did Sichon have? Nothing. He was a wicked king. What merit did Bilam have? They were all wicked people. But Og, he's the guy that did a favor to Avram. He's the guy that helped the Jewish people. God doesn't forget those who do favors to those people he loved. 1 second. Which means, think about this, by the way. How many years ago did this story happen? How many years ago did the story of Og coming to Avram and telling him that your nephew Lot was captured together with me and the Rephaim and the people from Sodom? How many years before Moshe is standing by the banks of the... Well, yeah, basically 400 years. Correct. It's about 400 years. When Yitzchak is born, until the Jews come to Israel, it's 400. Until they leave Egypt, it's 400. So it's more than 400 years. It's like 430 years.
But giants live that long.
Giants, yeah, your giants live 400 years. But the point is, most people at that time didn't live 400 years anymore. Pre-flood, they did.
Right.
But after the flood, how long did people live? How long did Avram live for? 175 years. Moshe lived 120 years. You know what I'm saying? Yosef lived 110 years. So they lived longer than we do today, but they didn't live 400 years. Even the righteous people didn't live that long. Yaakov lived 147, you know what I'm saying? So to live 400 years, he was already a person, at least 400 years. He's not, and he died now, an unnatural death. He got killed by Moshe, but he was still a strong man. He was still like lifting weights, you know what I'm saying? He's lifting mountains. And
he wasn't a baby when he...
Correct. He wasn't a baby when he escaped, when he was the fugitive who escaped from the Rephaim. See, God kept him alive for hundreds of years. What was the merit that kept him alive so many years? The favor he did to Avram. So when Moshe is coming, we understand now the story a little bit better. When Moshe is coming, he says, oh, this is the guy who helped Avram, who saved Lot. He's still around. He's still alive. 400 years later, he's taking care of him. He has divine protection. And that's why Moshe gets afraid of him. And that's why God has to tell Moshe, don't be afraid. Yes, it's true, he had divine merit. He earned his 400 years, but I'm going to put him into your hands. Don't worry about him. His time is over. You'll be victorious over him. Don't be afraid. I mean, Moshe is not afraid of his physical might or his physical size. We don't find anywhere in the Torah Moshe is afraid of someone's physical size. Moshe is afraid of the kindness that he did 400 years earlier to Lot and to Avram. Okay? So now we know why he's afraid of Og. But my friend, let's continue reading this Rashi. So I read only the first paragraph, right? But guess what? The second paragraph is even more cool. I know you guys like cool stuff, so let's read the second paragraph. Yes, we won't let you down. So the second paragraph in the Rashi says as follows. The Medrash, Genesis Rabbah explains, this is Og, this fugitive, who escaped the generation of the flood. Not that he was a fugitive who escaped the war of Kidala Omer and the 4 kings against the 5 kings. No. He's a fugitive who escaped the destruction of the entire universe when God brought a flood on the world. And this is the meaning of he was the leftover from the rest of the Rephaim, our verse in Deuteronomy. As it is stated in the beginning of Genesis chapter 6, the Nephilim were on the earth. And he intended that Avram should be killed and he would marry Sarah. Okay, that ends with something else. I should have been down a separate line. But the Nephilim were on the earth. Let's make this a separate line. There we go. You understand? So the Nephilim were on the earth. We'll get to the good stuff. What is it saying in this paragraph? Yonatan wants to know, what's it saying over here? What is it Medrash saying? Og is a fugitive who escaped from the generation of the flood. That's what it means. He was from the leftovers of the Rephaim. So I'm going to tell my friends a story of 2 angels. What was their names? Shamchaz and Azael. These two angels are very, very interesting story. I didn't bring the text here. It's not clear in the verses anyway. But in chapter 6, the very, very end of the parsha of Bereshis, right before the beginning of the story of Noah and the flood, the Torah tells us over there in chapter 6. You know what the Torah tells us? Yeah. We're gonna get there. Very good, Marsha. Yeah. Stay tuned. So in chapter 6, she's been around for a few years. It's a good story, but here I've never ever presented this, in such a coherent with all the sources. So the Torah tells us in chapter 6, the very end of Bereshis, that there were Bnei Nephilim, there were sons of giants that fell. They were princes, Bnei Lakim, that fell onto earth, and they were here. Who are these people? These princes? So one is to say we're princes. That's a simple reading. But then the rabbis tell us that when the people on earth were sinning and the world was becoming corrupt, and God was beginning to regret making man, he wanted to destroy the world. So the angels come before Hashem. They say to God, God, you should have listened to us. Like when your husband gets into a fight with you, right? Yeah, I told you should listen to me, right? So the angels come to God and say, God, you should have listened to us. When God was making man, the angels came when they saw that God was making man and said, what are you doing? So we're making man. And the angels didn't like the idea. They said, why are you going down there? You have us up here. So now that they're sinning, the angel said, you see, we were right. You would have been better off just having the angels. So God says to the angels, I know that if you would be down there on earth with the Yetzer Hara, with the evil inclination, and all the temptations, and all the seduction, and all the distraction of the physical world, you would be even worse than the people. So the angels say, yeah, let's see. I will show you that it's the people that are corrupt, but that if we would be on the earth with all the temptation and all the desires of the universe, we would be righteous. So there were angels that were taken down. They fell down. Nephilim. They fell down from the heavens. They were named Shamchazai and Azael. And they came down to earth in human form. But they were Bnei Elokim. They were sons of God. They were angels. And what happens? They come and they see these unbelievably beautiful women. And the desire and temptation was burning within them so much they couldn't resist. And they were literally snatching brides on their wedding nights and raping them before they would get married. They committed all kinds of sexual immoral crimes, all kinds. Whatever you can imagine, they did. These angels, Shamchaz and Azael. And that's what they called Nephilim, not only because they fell from heaven to earth, but when they came to earth, their spiritual stature fell. Nephilim means to fall. They fell in their spiritual stature, and instead of being holier than people, they became even more corrupt and more depraved and more immoral than the human beings that they had tried to prove wrong. This is before the flood. To chapter 6 of Genesis, the very last verses of the Parsha Bereshis, literally the very end of Bereshis. And then it said that God had remorse for making the world. And then comes the beginning of Noah. There was a man called Noah. He was Ish Tzaddik, and God to make the ark, and the story of the flood. So the rabbis tell us that when these angels, Shamchazai and Azael, were intimate and had sex with these innocent girls that they raped, they created giants from the unions. And so the world was full of giants who were very, very physically powerful. Why were they very physically powerful? Because they were sons of angels. So if you have spiritual power, it reflects in a physical manifestation of physical power. So these people, these physical giants, who were born from spiritual giants, or they were spiritual giants before they became spiritually corrupt, became unbelievably wicked, evil people who committed every kind of immoral crime you can imagine, because that's where they came from. And that's why God made a flood to destroy all of the world, to destroy all of these giants that had become so spiritually corrupted and so morally depraved. Except that God left one remnant behind. This is what the paragraph we just read is telling to us. That God left one remnant, one fugitive, one polit, one escapee. Not a person who escaped the war of Kedala Omer, but one person who escaped the destruction of the flood. One Miyeser, one last remnant who survived. And who was this? Og, who eventually became the king of Bashan. He was a giant from pre-flood times, which would explain his gigantic size, which would explain his unbelievable length of years that he lived for many. If he was from before the flood, that meant he lived. We're talking now to 1920. The Jews entered the land of Israel in the year 2488. So he's around for over 1,000 years. Long time, more than 1,000 years, very long time. But people lived that long back then, pre-flood. So he had a pre-flood DNA, so to say. He was a massive, massive giant like the people who lived before the flood. And he lived that long. Now the question is, how did he physically, logistically survive the flood? The flood was water pouring down on the universe. There was no food, there was no nothing. So the commentaries tell us, the Medrash tells us, that he came, Og was very smart. He heard the flood was coming. All the other people that heard about the flood, what did they do? They laughed. They scoffed. They said, no, he went crazy. You think God's bring a flood and destroy us? Not going to happen. One person listened. His name was Og. And Og came to Noach and to his sons and said, if you save my life, I will be a slave to you forever. And so they built a shelf outside the ark. He couldn't go inside the ark. He was outside the ark. He sat on the shelf. He held on. He's a big man. So he held on to the outside of the ark. Got narrower on the top. The ark was in a triangular shape, like a roof. And you want the water to flow off. So it's not straight. It was triangular. So it got wider on the bottom and narrower on the top. So he could sit on it, and hold on. He wouldn't fall down. He literally straddled the ark for the entire 365 days that the ark was circling, and Noach made a hole. Either he made a hole, I saw in the Medrash, he made a hole in the thing to open to give food, or the classic is he opened the window. There was a window on the top, the skylight, we could let the dove out, right? Let the raven out. He would open the skylight every day and feed Og. In exchange for Og's promise to serve the Jews, to serve Noach. So now we have an even greater appreciation of who is Og. He's a person that God chose or allowed to survive the flood, to be the only remnant of an era that was gone. And God promises Abraham that your children will inherit the land of the Rephaim, meaning these giants that came from the Shamchazai and Azal, the angels. And now Moshe is coming and he sees this giant who's not just a physical giant. He's a child of angels. He's a child of angels that survived the flood, who God saved from the flood. He obviously has divine merit. He obviously has some spiritual protection taking care of him if he survived so long. And now we understand why Moshe is afraid. This is a guy, he survived the flood. I'm going to go fight him. You understand? Makes sense. That's why he was afraid. That's why he was afraid. At the very end of Rashi says, so why did he fall into the hands of Moshe? Why did he fall into the hands of Moshe? Because even though he had the merit, God said, why is he saving the life of because he'll save Lot and help. But when he saved Lot, why did he save Lot? Not because he had pure intentions. The very end of Rashi tells us, why did he save Lot? Were his intentions pure and holy? No, the very last line of Rashi tells us, why did he do it? And he, Og, intended that Abram should be killed and he would marry Sarah. This was his intention. He wasn't so righteous. He still had a little bit of that DNA of those sexually depraved angels that he came from, who had these desires to have intimacy with a woman. So he saw Sarah was a beautiful woman, but she was married. So he says, let me tell Abraham about the war where his nephew was killed. I know Abraham. He's not going to sit home when his nephew is captured and being sold as a slave. He's going to go fight for his nephew. Now, he has no chance of winning, but that's Avram. He's crazy. He doesn't care about logic. So he's going to go fight. He's going to get killed. Sarah will now become a widow, and I'll be able to marry Sarah and live happily ever after. So because Og's intentions were self-serving, not for the sake of heaven, not for the sake of helping the family of Avram, but really for his own benefit, that's why he was not protected any longer, and God allowed him to fall into the hands of Moshe. Fascinating story.
But he still let him live a really long time.
Yeah. Oh, yes, he did. What? Excellent question. Why would God let him survive the flood? Because of this very reason, that he would have the merit of saving. God already saw that he would be the one to save Lot, and because of that, that merit is what allowed him to be spared from the flood. Which is why Moshe was so afraid of that merit. If that merit of doing a favor to Avram and saving Lot isn't worthy enough of a merit to save you from being destroyed in the flood, maybe it's strong enough to protect you from Moshe as well.
Could you argue it's not a favor if he was intending on killing him by having him go?
It's not. That's why we're saying that his intentions were impure, which is why favor only lasted up to a certain point, but didn't stop him from Moshe's war. If you could ask the question, if he would have had pure intentions, maybe he would have been protected from Moshe, perhaps. But that's not the way the story went down, so we don't have to worry about it.
Plus, he broke his promise to Abraham to be a slave.
Yes, that's also true. That's correct. Yes.
But still, he was probably the longest living person that you know.
Well, there's some people, okay, is he the longest living person? Or besides for people that never die, we talked about Pinchas, who never died, right? Eliyahu. But
he wasn't a righteous guy.
no, he was not a righteous guy. He was righteous. There was something righteous about Og. What was righteous about Og is that pre-flood, he recognized that God is right and that the world will be destroyed. He was the only person that didn't laugh and scoff and say, oh, we'll stop the flood. He came to Noah and said, to the flood, I'll be your slave, save me. So there was some level of righteousness to him, but obviously, and that's also why he was saved from being destroyed by the war of Kidla Omer. God kept him alive. He was protected. Everyone else was destroyed. He was the only one that survived. So he was saved 2 times. Once by the flood, once by the war of the 4 kings, by Kidla Omer, and that's why Moshe was afraid of him.
And then did he have any more kids?
I don't think so. If they were big. I know. Of course. Yeah. Very good. He did have kids. Very good. Robert's a good student. Which kids did he have? We talked about his child. I don't know if it was his child. You know who he had a kid? That's right. Goliath. We talked about the class on Ruth. Ammon. If you remember Orpah, the sister-in-law of Ruth. If you remember Orpah, the sister-in-law of Ruth, she, after Ruth and Orpah separated ways, Ruth went to the Jewish people, and Orpah went to become like a threshing field, where a whole bunch of people were threshing the field. I'll let you figure out what that means, including Og, or the descendants of Og, and Goliath, the giant, is actually born a descendant of Og. Very good, Robert. I'm proud of you. You get an extra cookie. Definitely deserve an extra cookie tonight. Yeah. That's a good question. I don't know.
Miracle.
Yeah, I don't know if I can answer that question. Okay, now we're going to get to some spiritual stuff and some life lessons for us, because even though this is a fascinating story, right? And this is a fascinating biblical character that most people even know about, but what's the lesson for me? Where's the me in the Bible? This whole series is discovering me in the Bible. Where's the me in this story? We're not giants. We're not Og. We don't sleep on iron steel beds that are who knows how long. We didn't survive the flood. So where's the me in the story? So if we go back to this verse 11 that we read earlier tonight, describing who is Og. Remember that verse we read before? Read it again one more time. Let me share my screen for those who are watching us on Facebook. And we'll share verse number 11 from this week's Torah reading. And the Torah tells us 2 things about Og. Number 1 is for only Og, verse 11, king of Bashan, was left from the remnant of the Rephaim. So now we understand that part of the verse. We know who the Rephaim are. We know why Og is special, why Moshe is afraid of him. He's a survivor. But now let's understand the rest of the verse. His bedstead, was a bed of iron. It is not. Is it not in the museum in Rabbah of the children of Ammon? 9 cubits was its length, 4 cubits its breadth, according to the cubit of a man, which I said could be the cubit, the length of his arms, which could be who knows how big. He had a massive bed that went on display in the Smithsonian or in the Ripley's Believe It or Not museum, right? Ripley's Believe It or Not, the largest bed in the world made out of iron. Why does the Torah feel the need to tell us about the bed of? Good question. He was made of iron. Like where else does the Torah tell you how big Paro's bed was? How big his crown was, his throne? I say, do you know anyone else in the Torah? The Torah tells you, oh, this guy, he had a bed that was, what's the lesson here? What's the story here? Now, the only comparison you can maybe say, we mentioned Goliath earlier. So Medrash says it compares the Torah telling us about the bed of Og to the Torah describing the armor of Goliath. The Torah describes how big was the armor of Goliath to give you an appreciation for the miracle of King David. Then he was a shepherd, he wasn't a king yet. For David to be able to kill Goliath, to appreciate the greatness of the miracle. You should know that the armor of Goliath was however many cubits big. I don't remember offhand. The Medrash compares it. So too, by telling you how big is the bed of Og, it gives you an appreciation for how big was the miracle that Moshe was able to kill it. Fine. But it's still very unique to describe the bed. You just say he was a giant, right? Just say he was a big guy. Why do we need to know about his bed? His bed was made of iron, not wood. Wood wouldn't handle his weight.
By the way, with those measurements, does it make sense that Og would survive in the ark? Because those measurements,
Yeah.
He was giant with the ark?
Well, yeah, the ark was 1 amma at the top. It was 30 amos at the bottom. And, so it was like he straddled the ark. Okay. So as I mentioned earlier, tonight is the yard site of the holy Arizal. The Arizal, he lived in, Yitzchak Luria was his name. He lived in Tzfat. He was probably the greatest Kabbalist of history after Rav Shimon Bar Yochai. He explained most of the Kabbalistic ideas that we have today are based on the teachings of the Arizal, primarily as they were transcribed through his student, Rabbi Chaim Vital. The Arizal didn't write on his own anything. The Arizal taught, died at a very, very young age. Everything that we have from the Arizal was all written down and taught by Rabbi Chaim Vital. So since tonight is his yard site, I'm going to show you an explanation on this verse based on the teaching of the Arizal. Okay? So the Arizal tells us, if you look at the word barzel, the Hebrew word for iron, barzel. What is barzel? There's 4 Hebrew letters for the word barzel. So let's get a little Kabbalistic tonight. We're doing so many good stuff anyway. So you look at the second sheet there, and the Arizal tells us as follows. The word barzel, which means iron, has 4 Hebrew letters. Beis, Resh, Zayin, Lamed. These stand for the 4 matriarchs of the Jewish people. Bilhah and Rachel. Bilhah was the maid of Rachel. Zilpah and Leah. You see that in the 4, right? That's barzel, iron. So when the Torah tells us that Eretz barzel, that his bed was a bedstead of barzel, of iron, it's hinting to the 4 matriarchs, Bilhah, Rachel, Zilpah, Leah. Okay, and what's the point? What do you notice about the order of these 4 women, the way it's described? What do you notice, my smart friends? The order. What's the order? First is Bilhah. Bilhah is the maid of Rachel. So it says Bilhah, the maid, then the mistress, Rachel. Zilpah, and then Leah. So it's saying first the maid, and then the mistress. First the maid, then the mistress. The order here is a little bit, or a lot of it, backwards. It should first say Leah, or Rachel, whichever one, Leah is the oldest, and her maid. Rachel and her maid, not the other way around. First Bilhah, then Rachel. So what's the explanation? We also know in Kabbalah, now Arizal explains, that everything that exists in holiness has a counterpart in unholiness. That's a basic rule in Kabbalah, that everything in the world has to have a counterpart, or else it's not a fair world. God made the world with an exact, perfect balance. We discussed this before. It's a very basic idea. The entire universe was created with one opposite the other. There has to be a counterbalance. And so that means if you have a bed of barzel, if you have a bed of iron that Og sleeps on, Og obviously represents the epitome of klipa, of unholiness. There has to also be a bed of holiness. of purity. So what's the bed of purity? You know what the bedroom in Judaism is? You have the bed of oak, and then you have the inner sanctuary, the inner sanctum, where you have God's private space. Bedroom is a private place. And we are told that what is considered the private room, the private bedroom, the most innermost sanctum of God's presence in the universe, the Kodesh HaKadosh, the Holy of Holies in the Beis HaMikdash, or in the Mishkan. The innermost chamber that no one's allowed to go there is like the bedroom where no one's allowed to go. So you have, in holiness, you have the ark, you have the temple, and in unholiness, you have the bed of oak. Do you know what you were not allowed to use in construction of the temple? Steel, iron. When they built the Beis HaMikdash and they made these massive stones, what does the Torah explicitly say they were not allowed to do? Not to use any iron in the building of the Beis HaMikdash. You're not allowed to use why? Why? Because what is iron used for? To kill. And the temple had to be a place of peace and love. So they were not allowed to use iron in the building of the Beis HaMikdash. So the iron of Og's bed is the exact opposite of the building of God's bedroom, which has no iron. So now the Rizal teaches us what is the order of the Barzell? First the maids, then the mothers. What does a bed in unholy world look like? Backwards priorities. Where the mistress, who's serving who? Who's serving who? Is the maid serving the mistress, or is the mistress serving the maid? In Barzel, in iron, what happens? The external, the superficial takes priority over the mistress. The Bilha, the Bays, the maid, comes before Rachel. The Zilpah, the maid, comes before Leah. In the external world of Klippa, the outside husk, the outside shell, takes priority over the inner fruit. That's Klippa. That's the forces of impurity. I'm not giving a Kabbalistic class on Klippa on what a shell is, but in 10 seconds, what is a shell? It's the outside. It sucks its energy and life from the fruit, correct? So in unholiness, what do you see? The outside of the fruit, the cover of the book, the external, the superficial, and you get distracted by the superficial, by things that are secondary, and you lose focus on the primary, on what's really true. In holiness and Kedusha, it's the exact opposite. Holiness means that you don't get distracted by superficialities. Holiness means you don't get distracted by all the external things happening around you, but you stay true to who you are inside, who you really are. Says the Torah to us, the bed of Og was a bed of Barzel. It was a bed of misconstrued, perverted priorities, where the external became primary and the internal became secondary. That's the definition of unholiness. That's the definition of the bed of Og. The bed you're not allowed to use in the temple. You can't use that in the temple. So what's the lesson for us? Og had unbelievable gifts from God. Think about it. God made him an unbelievably strong, powerful, tall, muscular guy. He was very, very high, very, very tall, very strong, he lift mountains. He lived for hundreds and hundreds of years. God gave him tremendous talents. Not only that, he's a survivor. Not once did God save his life, but twice God saved his life. So he's a double survivor. What was he survived for? Well, God obviously survived him to save the nephew of Lot, to save the nephew of Avram, to save Lot, to do good in the world. But he didn't focus on the truth of why he was given, the tremendous strength and power he was given. He didn't focus on the fact that I'm a survivor. Why was I survived? Instead, he misconstrued it. He took the external, he took the fact that he survived without looking into the why, the inner meaning, the inner depth, the inner purpose of his survival, and got distracted by the superficial and forgot about what was real. Are we ever guilty of that? Are we ever guilty I mean, my friends, we're all survivors. Every one of us is a survivor. Some of us know we're survivors because, God forbid, they went through the Holocaust, or God forbid, they were in a terrible car accident and the car over 2 times. You walk out of that accident and say, wow, God obviously wants me alive for a purpose. And sometimes we don't see how God survived us. We're not aware of any death experiences where our life flashed before our eyes and we thought this is the end, and then somehow we came out of the other side. But just because we didn't face a near-death experience, just because we didn't spend, God forbid, a month in the hospital or any other life-threatening illness, I was just speaking to someone just now, a few days ago. He was very, very sick, and now thank God he's recuperating, he's getting better. And he said, like, my whole life is a whole new sense of priorities, and he wants to start coming to shul, and I started getting much more spiritually involved. Like, he's still in the hospital. I saw him now, but he was like, thank God, he's not in a crisis situation. There was a moment that he thought he was going to die. There was a moment that he thought his life flashed before his eyes. He thought, I'm over. I'm over. He was telling me, now I realize he's not a young gentleman. I realize, I'm a survivor. But we're all survivors. Every one of us are survivors. The fact that we woke up this morning, I give thanks to you, God, because you returned my soul. I survived the night. And the fact that I woke up this morning means that God said, I'm surviving you for a reason. The question is, do we recognize the reason why we are being survived? Are we able to focus on the inner sanctum, on the inner truth, on the inner dimension, and know who is serving who? Or do we fall prey to the superficiality of the world in which we live? Do we fall prey to the external glitter of the shell, of the klipa, of the husk of physical existence and physical distraction and temptation? And we forget why God gave us all the gifts that God gave us. We forget why we have all of the strength and power and might and money and talents and resources. We forget it all. We forget why we're survivors. Understand? That's the barzah. There's a very, very inspiring lady. Very inspiring lady. Another lady's in the book club, read her book, The Hope. Dr. Ida, what's the name? Ida, my notes over here. Dr. Edith Eva Egger. I didn't read her book, but my wife read it, and I've heard about her. You know who she is? She was in the camps. She went through many, many camps. She was a Holocaust survivor. She was from Czechoslovakia. And then she was taken to, she was in Mauthausen, different camps, and she was with her sister Magda. And at one point, while she was there, they had to dance for Mengele was there, and he made them dance, some girls dance for him. As a reward, he gave them bread, and she shared the bread with another girl. And then later, when she was on the death march, that girl recognized her and helped her. She couldn't walk. And then she was left for dead on the pile of bodies. And that's when they were liberated, and a soldier saw her hand moving and rescued her. She weighed 32 kilograms when she was rescued after the war, 32 kilograms. And she writes in her book called The Hope that for many, many years, she carried a survivor's guilt. She carried this tremendous guilt in her. Why did I survive? The rest of my family didn't survive, etc. Many survivors carried a survivor's guilt. And then when she was 47 years old, when she was 49 years old, she decided to go back to school, and she became a psychologist, and she used her life experience and her training to give hope to other survivors and to be a psychologist and to give new hope to thousands and thousands of people. She wrote a book. She travels, she speaks. For many years, she was only focused on the external aspect of her survival. And because she couldn't get past the external factor, the fact that why did I survive? And why did my other family not survive? And why did this person not survive? She just was overwhelmed with the grief and the guilt. When she was able to get past the external shell, and she was able to get into her reason for existence, when she was able to understand why God gave her the talents that God gave her, she's very talented, then her life became meaningful, then her life became purposeful, and then she became a holy person. Not that she wasn't holy before, but she became holy, being able to do something powerful with her life. And this is the story of Og for us in the Bible. We can have a lot of gifts from God. We can be super strong, super powerful, super rich, super super living a long time. We could be survivors knowingly, unknowingly, and be oblivious to the gift of God, and be living with misconstrued priorities, and living an external, superficial life of physical indulgence, focus on the physical of the universe, on the superficial husk of existence, and never get deep into the why of our existence, for why we're survivors. What was God's purpose for surviving us today? But if we want to be holy, we can't live misconstrued priorities. We can't put the maid before the mistress. We can't put the shell before the fruit. We can't put the external before the real. We can't sleep on beds of iron. We need to go into the Holy of Holies where there's no iron. And there we live a life of inner purpose, a life of truth. And that's the way we need to live our lives. Not to be like Og, who was a giant, but he slept on iron. He's a giant, but he slept on iron. He slept on the misconstrued priorities of the external without focusing on what was real. Okay, my friends, that is the story of Og, the giant who scared Moshe.